Hello, everyone. My name is Stephen Bartkist. I'm the curator of the Gunn Historical Museum in Washington, Connecticut. I'd like to welcome you to our Reading from the Archives program. If you're new to this program, we're very fortunate to have a bunch of wonderful papers that were written by Washington residents about 100 years ago. And what I do is I select them and I present them with some photographs from our collection. So for this evening, I've selected two short readings. One will be about 10 minutes long and the other about 20 minutes. This program is being recorded and everyone is muted, but when I'm finished with the reading, I'll unmute everyone and we could have a discussion. Perhaps there are questions that you have or stories or memories that you'd like to share with the rest of the group. So with that, I'd like to get started. This is a paper of Memories of or Near Washington Green, 1872 to 1875 by Clarence Nettleton. Until now, 1872, we only need to say Washington. But we have a railroad, and Washington Depot is on the main line of the Chappaqua Valley Railroad from Hawleyville to Litchfield. 2 passenger trains round trip and a freight each way, we hope. Until then, our passengers and mail came by stage from New Milford, and dry goods and groceries, mostly by E.J. Hurlburt's teams from New Haven, or on the way back from New Haven, the Seymour Railroad Station, or the freight dock at Derby. We will start on Sunday morning as we wish to take a look at the interior of our church, and who can find the key to enter during the week, for it is always locked unless maybe a funeral happens along. We enter the green at the northeast corner by F.N. Galpin's barn, where the Gunn Memorial Library now stands, and drive up to the stone horse blocks to unload. We are just in time as the last bell has tolled, and hurry on to the sheds to care for our team. The sheds are at the back of the post office and drugstore, which then stood out on the main road with a drive on each side to enter the sheds at the rear. We find nearly all of the 44 sheds now full, as we are a little late, but we are sure to find ours waiting empty for us where we will leave our team, for there is no other place on the green where they should be left. The outside of the church has not been changed much, only at each end. The addition for the organ at the north and the roof over the stone steps and horse blocks at the south. We enter the church on the level as the main floor was just with the vestibule. We go up to the west galleries, the men's, and find the service beginning with singing. Mr. Colton, very erect in the pulpit, but now the choir and the organ was the center of interest in the south gallery. Mr. Earl Buckingham, leader, and beating time the organist seated on a high bench with her back to me. I think it was Mrs. W.J. Ford, but later, for 30 or 40 years, it was Mrs. Powell Seeley. Also, Luman Woodruff, who pumped the organ and used to say he played the organ. The stovepipes, under galleries, big square posts, all were there, but we must not stop for now. The service, as the minimum, the sermon will be 30 minutes. As we leave the church, we look around the green. All the houses have fences in front of their yards and no trees on the green, only around the church. The Gunnery baseball diamond west of the church, the third base very near the southwest corner of the church, the home base and catcher stand being at the north end of the green. So any ball going toward the church would sure be a foul ball. Very few balls hit the church owing to the protection of the trees, and the blinds were always kept closed to save the windows. A few clapboards and slats were cracked though. At the southeast corner of the green is the Center District Schoolhouse, which was moved away, and also the Academy building, which stood very near it. The Washington Library Association had closets on the second floor of the Academy building, with swinging doors in front of its shelves of books. The library meetings were held once a month on evenings near the full moon. Mr. S.J. Logan, with a candle, or maybe later a hand lamp, would take the books row by row, calling the books by the name pasted on their backs. He would read very fast, but if he wanted the book, he would bid 2 cents and the auction would be started. If no competition, the book was struck off to you and the reading continued. But in case of popular new books or the last edition of Harper's or Scribner's magazines, the bidding would be very competitive. And often nearly the full price of the book or magazine would be paid. And this, for a lad, was great fun, but we could get an armful of books and copies of not the latest magazines for less than a quarter, with entertainment for the evenings and good reading for a month. The Harper's magazines were nicely bound, several months in a volume, and kept for rental for years at the library. I have several books now from the dispersal sale of this library. After the Academy building and schoolhouse were removed in 1873, I was watching during my noon hour from school men setting stakes and putting up frames ready for the foundation of the new hall building. Mr. Simeon Calhoun, the head carpenter of the job, was holding a stake with another man with a very heavy sledgehammer to drive. The hammer either slipped off the end of the handle or broke and struck Mr. Calhoun squarely in the face, knocking him instantly to the ground. There proved to be several bones injured, and he was laid off for several days, but after the foundations were ready, he was back on the job again. We will now go down the hill, a steep hill, to E.J. Hurlbert's store and barn, which were where the tennis courts now are, near the clubhouse, which was Mr. Hurlbert's dwelling. Farmer's Hall is painted on the store in large letters on the end over the broad veranda, which is under the stage for the hall. Beside the store was the barn and the stairs to the hall, which must have been in the edge of the barn. Under the store and veranda were horse stalls and shelter for wagons, and under the barn, stables for cattle, and south of the barn, a row of some half-dozen open sheds, very handy for all customers. In back of the sheds is the barnyard, and on the other side of which was a slaughterhouse, where the meat for the market and for sale is butchered. We have no rubber boots on, so we will not cross the yard to inspect it now. We will now go inside the store and meet Mr. Hurlbert. He is a strong, well-built, and very pleasant man who everyone must like. He had a bit of most everything in the line of dry goods, groceries, hardware, and even a showcase of candies, and a few steps down, maybe in the edge of the barn, the meat counter. Also hogsheads of molasses, barrels of oil, flour, and almost anything you may need. If you bought a barrel of flour, Mr. Hurlbert will drop it in your wagon over the end board when you backed up your horse before you could even drop your lines. Now we must go upstairs to Farmer's Hall, the only place in Washington outside of the churches for a public gathering now. We go upstairs, the only entrance to the hall, between the store and barn, over the barrels of molasses and oil, and find a large, well-lighted hall with a fine stage on the west end. Here we go for the plays by the drama lights of Uncle Tom's Cabin, Neighbor Jackwood, and any other public meetings. Here, one winter, I went to singing school taught by Mr. Earl Buckingham, found another thing that I was no good at doing. Deacon Abernathy, nearly opposite the gunnery, had a workshop and made, among other things, ox carts, and they were made to stand up much better than the wonderful one-horse shay of November 1st, 1855. For this cart, made for my father nearly 100 years ago, had not even lost a spoke or even had one loose, and the body had not weakened in any way. It had been used for hard and heavy work, but always kept under cover when not in use. Now we are so near the gunnery, we must just stop in, for here I am now at school. We go down the boardwalk, onto the wide veranda, past the windows of the dining room, to the doors which open into the hall. At the right is the dining room, and at the left, the large reception room, where the plane for music and dancing is. Excuse me, the piano for music and dancing is. Immediately in front of the outside front doors is a long flight of stairs. On the second floor are most of the boys' rooms. So we go up another flight of stairs and find 2 resuscitation rooms and a large schoolroom. At this time, the resuscitation rooms were used by Miss Lily Gunn and Miss Amy Kenyon. The large, well-lighted schoolroom at the north end was Mr. Gunn's room. He was seated in a large office chair on a platform in front of the north windows. We have been so long on our trip that this is Friday. There are no lessons on Friday, for the school is evenly divided. So one section has compositions and the other speaking. And the next week, the reverse. The ones writing compositions hand them in to the teachers for correction, and 2 or 3 of the best are read at the afternoon session. In the schoolroom, Mr. Gunn is hearing and training the ones who are to speak their pieces in the afternoon. This rehearsing is no easy task, I can tell you, for one of the least of the rehearsals is the memorizing. In the afternoon session, all the scholars are in their places and the doors are open, ready and glad of visitors. Mr. Gunn had many different and very original punishments for the boys. The most common one was to pump a certain number of minutes. The pump was in the kitchen, and the tank for the supply of the house in the 3rd story. In these days, there was no electricity or gas, so the tank was replenished by hand power. On one Friday morning, Mr. Gunn, after rehearsing a piece several times and trying to have the boy make a gesture at a certain place, got impatient and said to the school, quote, "At the noon hour, you may go up in front of Hurlbert's store and pick up ginger pop bottle corks. And this afternoon, if he does not make the gesture at the right time, you may throw them at him," end quote. You can be sure there were no more corks left in front of Hurlbert's store. When afternoon came, all the boys were ready, and several had 2 corks also ready. When the boy spoke his piece, he did not make the gesture, and there was a tremendous shower of corks. And I am sure some hit Mr. Gunn, and I think not by mistake. And we heard some hit the windows behind him with great force. So Mr. Gunn investigated and found these corks loaded with lead. There was a family meeting called for that evening. Thus endeth a week spent around the green, as I cannot return for the Friday night reception at the Gunnery. And this concludes our first reading this evening, a paper of memories of or near Washington Green, 1872 to 1875 by Clarence Nettleton. Just want to get my next reading ready. Just give me one moment here. I'll be back in 2 seconds. Don't go anywhere. Okay, and our next reading is Reminiscences of Life in Washington by Reverend Henry Calhoun, and this was written in 1892. Dr. Horace Bushnell, who grew up in the neighboring parish of New Preston, gives us the genesis of his life after this fashion. Quote, "I have been told that my arrival in this earthly sphere was on April the 14th of 1802. I have no recollection of any other state from which I came, and have no reason to think that I came from any other state at all. I suppose that my soul was not made but generated, being the son of one soul, which was the son of another, which was the son of God. But these parent souls out of which I came, I do not remember as having been in any way conversant with them. I have only heard of some of them by report. Indeed, I came as scarcely knowing myself, being only a tender rubicund mollusk of a creature, when I began this rough battle with winds, winters, and wickedness, end quote. This may do very well for so renowned a writer, one of the great quickeners of the world's thought, but humbler people, little boats should keep nearer shore. You should see before you what is left from the tooth of time of the solid chunk of a barefoot boy who was born in 1818 and lived in the most of his boyhood in the upper end of Washington society. You will, of course, take that remark in a strictly geographical, not society sense. Until entering upon his teens, he attended the district school in the Little Red Schoolhouse, the People's College, and hunted and fished like a young Nimrod when not at school or occupied with the numerous summer or winter cares of the small homestead. Dr. Bushnell says of New Preston, his boyhood home, what will apply as well to Washington, my own, quote, this rough, wild region bears a race of healthy-minded, healthy-bodied, industrious, and religious people. Out of this obscure nook among the mountains have come forth 2 presidents of colleges, a secretary of state for a quarter of a century, a member of Congress, a distinguished professor, and a great number of lawyers, physicians, preachers, teachers, male and female, than I am able to enumerate, end quote. Others as distinguished have arisen since this was written. Many cities of 20,000 inhabitants have not exerted half the influence of this obscure region, hardly named in our atlases. It has been happily said, quote, verily does genius seem to love to hatch her offspring in out-of-the-way nests and nooks, end quote. Surely one can afford to be born and swarm out of such a hive of distinguished and undistinguished scholars. My youthful environment was among these vertebrate rocks and hills, among sturdy yeoman farmers, their hardy boys, nice girls, and all the simple outdoor pastoral life of 70 years ago. The mothers and sisters devoted to the spinning wheel, the hand loom, the sewing and knitting needles. How pleasantly I recall the music of the spinning and weaving room. Both my parents were Puritans of the Puritans. They believed in something. Their lives went by their consciences, and their clocks did by the sun, keeping Saturday evening as sacredly as the Sabbath itself. Somehow, in my case, Puritanism struck in well and made a fast color that has not washed out in nearly 15 years. Often did my loving mother arrest my secular whittling, hush to silence the lad's profane whistling with all worldly reading on the Lord's day, chiding him sharply for irreverently running when the service was over, from the church door to the hitching place of our one-horse carryall. Nor did I dare leave home for sport or play on Sabbath Eve until the sun was fairly down, any more than I would dare to tell a lie. Still, we were a happy set of youngsters. The very air breathed vigor and purity. No artificial rock ornamentation was needed to set off the landscape. Nature's rock work was quite sufficient for that purpose. And beside, had excellent staying qualities. Our youthful spirits were buoyant as the wing of the bird and as fresh as its morning song. We lived close to nature, if not to nature's God. Though not familiar with the fashionable games of this day, we knew where to find the wild strawberries, the blackberry, huckleberry, and hazelnut patches, and the best chestnut and hickory trees. We knew where all the young wintergreen and honeysuckle apples grew, as we called them, in their season. The rabbit, the woodchuck burrows, the squirrel's nests with the hole of the chipmunk, concerning which the standing wonder of the day was how could dig so deep in the earth without leaving a pile of dirt at the entrance. This most difficult conundrum was answered by saying that he began on the other end. Perhaps you all know better now, you ought to, but you must remember that there was no gunnery in those days. A faithful dog was my constant companion, and there is not much use for anything that an active boy and a sharp dog do not find and enjoy, at least a dog who could in his way recite the names of all the presidents, from George Washington to Andrew Jackson, then in office. I cannot stop now to tell you how he did it. Time is too precious here today. We knew nearly every living creature, every bird, bird's nest, and bird note. Many of their songs we could translate into not very bad English. There were the cawing black crows, flying straight as the crow flies from the crow flies to their inaccessible nests in some tall pines in the heart of the cranberry marsh. The red-headed and yellow-breasted woodpeckers beat their rat-a-tat-tats on the ridgepole of the house or barn and dug their nest hole in the dry limbs of the old orchard. The bobolink's nests we could never find, though watching for them as sharply as ever we could. We translated the early bluebird songs into Purity, Purity, the robins into Cheerily, Cheerily are we, the meadowlarks into You Can't See Me. The chatter of the wren we could never quite turn into English any more than we can much of our church music, for as the Hibernian expressed himself, it was 5 notes to wantest. There was one bird unknown by name, whose song my mother used to say was 3 bullets, ways down prodigiously, prodigiously. To our ears in planting time, the brown thrasher's saucy cry was dig a hole, drop it in, spat it down, I'll dig it up, I'll dig it up. No boy ever knew much about fun who did not roll himself full of it in a fresh, fleecy snowdrift, or who never played 4 or 12 men Morris, fox and geese, mumblepeg, or 2 and 4 old cat. What boy ever rose to eminence who was not the only chore boy on the place, who was never supposed to get tired or want a holiday, whose only holidays were the glorious 4th, training days, and sheep washing, which to the boy and his dog was the best of them all? What boy ever succeeded in life who never went to the 0 cold meeting house when the preacher's breath froze in the tall pulpit and the communion bread froze on the table under its white cloth, with no fire except in the little foot stoves of our mothers, which good boys filled during the intermission with fresh coals from the glowing hearths of neighboring houses? The smell of the fire was very agreeable to those boys who took in their warmth in homeopathic, but their cold in allopathic doses. Wood stoves and fires were first introduced into this church during my boyhood, though I have not the exact date. I remember but the 2 pastors, Reverend Stephen Mason, who was gifted with all the proprieties and solemnities of his office, and Reverend Gordon Hayes, who was not so much so. The house of God was not cheered in those days by the presence of flowers except the flowers of rhetoric, and those were by no means as abundant as in later times. Instead of the cut flowers, we brought with us that flower of New England, housewifery, the raised donut with wintergreen, dill, fennel, caraway seeds, and sweet flag, which were not as fashionable as anti-sophoretics as they once were. Though even with all these, it was still necessary sometimes to try a vigorous pinch of oneself, or the sharp prick of a pin, and where nothing else would do, the elderly men rose and stood erect during the rest of the sermon, thus gaining a victory over the flesh, which was far better than giving over the fight, as the many do, now that there is no tithing man, pillory, nor other Puritan severity to terrify people into wakefulness. I have no recollection of the tithing man. My father knew him well, though, nor the Sabbath-day house, nor the pillory, but I once saw a culprit publicly whipped on this very green, his hands clasped round the body of an elm tree, which once stood a little northeast of this house, near the post to which we always hitched our horse, which had not learned the pious ways of one they used to tell about, which if not caught saddled and bridled Sunday morning as usual, would leap out of his enclosure and devoutly proceed on his way to meeting, stopping and standing quietly at his hitching place until the service closed. Then, pricking up his ears, he would reverently return home with the other worshipers, having said his prayers. Truly, these were the days of steady habits. Different races of people are described as belonging to the stone, brass, or iron ages. I presume my boyhood belongs to the pewter and homespun days, for I remember our pewter mugs and trenchers, as well as the wooden ones and pewter communion flagons. We had better dishes, but they were for state occasions. I wore homespun and did as did everybody else. We had no sewing, mowing, or reaping machines, no telegraphs, no telephones, no steam cars, no electric lights, or railroads. It was only an age of canals. The world 50 years ago would not know itself today. There were no matches, and if our firebrands went out on the hearth, the boys must run to the nearest neighbors for fresh coals, or the flint and steel and tinderbox were brought into use. Postage was 25 cents every letter, but there were no stamps or envelopes. Perhaps I might say that my birth occurred during a violent snow blizzard in the hard times following the War of 1812, and so I have passed through all the great money panics from that day to this. The blessing of birth came in the first. I entered college in the panic of 1837, enjoyed the greatest revival of my ministry in 1857, and built a $50,000 church in the hard times following 1873, so that I have learned that there are good times even in hard times. I was born in humble life. The prayer of augur for neither poverty nor riches was answered in the fullness of blessing in my days of pewter and homespun. How very strange that the spot where one is born should make such a difference to people who can live and thrive anywhere. There is something about that place which holds us by the heartstrings. The old house is today a desolation, but these everlasting mountains, hills, rocks, rivers, and babbling brooks, the sun, moon, and stars are all here still. It stood where 5 roads meet. The one to the north led to the grist mill and carding machine in Smoky Hollow at the foot of Mount Tom. That to the northeast brought us to Litchfield, 9 miles away, the county seat on the hill where Dr. Lyman Beecher was rearing his brood of 11 celebrities, of whom Henry Ward said, quote, "If you put us all together, we do not equal father," end quote. The third road led to the east over to Bethlehem, as they always spoke and wrote in early times, the parish of Dr. Bellamy, where my mother's ancestry used to worship. A fourth road, little frequented, ran to the south, down by the cow pasture to Carmel Hill, where my mother was born, and a bevy of as many and as lovable aunties as any good boy ever deserved to love. The last road led off southwest to Washington Green, most important and familiar of all. The sweet tones of 4 large church bells were sometimes floated over the hills to our ears on the quiet Sabbath mornings, of our own from the belfry on the green, that from New Preston, also South Farms, or Morris as the place is now called, and Bethlehem on the east. In these Puritan times, you notice the people gave scriptural names to places as well as the children. East of us was Bethlehem, then going west was Carmel Hill, then Judea, the old name for Washington, while still farther west was Canaan. But here, piety seems to have broken down, and the names of mountains, hills, streams, and hollows indicate an originality, secularity, and exuberance in no way biblical or puritanic. For right here in scriptural old Judea, we find such names as Upper End, Smoky, Davis, Pork, and even Hell Hollow, Mount Rat, Goose Hill, Sabaday Lane, Christian, and Calhoun Streets, Chapel Brook, Bee and Gunbrook, and Cobble and Mine Hill, most of which are still retained in the nomenclature of the nooks and corners of this truly pastoral region, any one of which would make an entrancing picture of still life if it were transferred to canvas. My father removed from Washington, Ohio, to Ohio in my 15th year. That winter, I taught my first school in a rude log schoolhouse, but was dismissed in dishonor before the term closed. I deserved my downfall, but out of such failures comes life's successes. That school board ought to have forfeited their reelection for ever hiring so young a lad. For some years following, I prosecuted my studies under discouragements, now teaching and now attending school. One year, I split rails enough to have elected me president if I had only been fortunate as Abraham Lincoln. In 1837, I was admitted to Kenyon College in Ohio, only 30 miles from my father's cabin. I graduated in 1841, leaving college after paying all my bills with more money than when I entered. There is not time to tell you more than that. These hands did it all. I was no beneficiary of any education board, had no wealthy patron, borrowed no money, made no debts, and earned all I spent. The next 4 years, I taught a classical school in Zanesville, Ohio, bought books, and read theology when I could, taking no seminary course. I was licensed and took charge of my first church in 1845, continuing in the ministry 40 years. During this time, I served 4 churches in as many beautiful Ohio valleys, each church located at a county seat as follows: 11 years at Coscatchin on the Muskegon, 9 at Circleville on the Scioto, 4 at Troy on the Miami, and 15 at Ironton on the Ohio River. Each of these churches has a prosperous history, numbering at this time respectively 220, 285, 387, and 205 members. Soon after my ordination, I was married to Jane Metcalf, a native of Lenox, Massachusetts. Together, we have shared these 40 years in the gospel ministry, closing in 1885. Since that time, preaching semi-occasionally, we have grown old together, enjoying a sort of Indian summer of life, being seldom separated from each other, so that where you find the one, you are very, very likely to find the other, as on this visit to my native land. But someone says, quote, why you became a Presbyterian minister? How could you desert the congregational flag, which under you were born and bred? Well, let me explain this very remarkable case of heredity. The Calhouns are all Scotch-Irish, and so originally Presbyterians. You see, I had Presbyterian blood in my veins, and blood is thicker than water. Blood will tell. You all know the river of Jordan flows through the blue sea of Galilee, and is the Jordan still for the rest of its course. So I came down through the New England Galilee of Congregationalism, a Presbyterian still. Somehow, after being swallowed alive by the great fish of Congregationalism, I was cast forth, again one day on dry land, and that land proved to be a friendly Presbyterian coast with no congregational dry land within 25 miles of me. And there I have lived safe, happy, and I hope that in some measure useful ever since. Is not that an explanation that explains? And now on this day of days, I am so happy to return to these long familiar scenes. I cannot say faces and look once more upon what is left of you and yours. The features of the landscape are all here, but little changed, stretching out to me the hand of glad welcome, as those who are not and those still here cannot do if they would. Except as I look the landscape over, I am among strangers. Only the babbling brooks speak a familiar voice. The age has come when I can no more do as I would. The world pays its good-natured compliments about our honorable past career, perhaps calling us emeritus pastors or professors, but with the shake of the head saying, quote, well, he is not any more what he once was, and somehow we got on very well without him, end quote. I must confess that I have never made much stir in the world, but I comfort myself out of the old New England proverb, quote, the empty cart makes the most noise, end quote. If I had turned heretic and preached some very unsound or sensational theology, doubtless the papers would have bezallied my fame over the continent or across the seas. Nor can I say that I have so lived that all have always spoken well of me. Very different is my experience from that of good Dr. John Calhoun, who lies among the Calhoun ancestry in the old burial ground here, whose headstone bears this very flattering inscription, quote, "Here lies one who served his generation to universal satisfaction," end quote. That will never do for me. I have never stood so exactly in the focus of the world's eye, and have never been so careful about now and then by doing my duty or by plainly speaking, making an enemy of two, nor have I felt the chief end of a sermon was to cause people to think well of themselves or the preacher. Well, farewell, we must now go his own way. God be with us till we meet again. May the blessing of the Most High rest ever on these beautiful hills, fair homes, and smiling valleys, and may those who abide and the thousands who may go hence to people and bless other lands dwell under the shadow of the Almighty until we all return and come with singing unto Zion, and everlasting joy shall be upon our heads. And that is the end of our second reading today, which was Reminiscences of Life in Washington by Reverend Henry Calhoun, and that was written in 1892. And with that, I have unmuted everyone, and anyone that would like to have a conversation about anything that they heard in either paper is welcome to raise their hand, and we could chat about what you heard. Anyone out there with any comments or questions for me or anyone else in the audience here today? I think I saw David raise his hand. Did David raise his hand? Hi, David.
Who is the Dr. Henry Calhoun? Who was his father? Do you know?
That is a good question. I didn't write that down exactly, but they lived, it sounds like, on Calhoun Street, where many of the Calhouns lived in Washington.
And, I hope so.
Right. And it seems like he lived here until his teens, I think is what he said. So his memories of Washington are very early.
So he was his family was part of the exodus from Connecticut in the 1820s and 30s.
Yeah, that's a good point. And do you want to tell everyone why, why that happened and where they were going?
Well, by the 1820s, there were a lot of people in Connecticut, and opportunities for inheriting land were sort of limited because at that time, the land was generally inherited by the oldest son. So the other sons in the family and other children in the family would sort of luck. And so when land opened up in Ohio, good, not stony New England land, there were a lot of New Englanders who, and especially people from Connecticut, who left and settled in a lot of them settled in Northwest Ohio, which was called the Northwest Territory, or the Connecticut Reserve, because it once was considered part of Connecticut until the early 1800s, when the territory of Ohio was established, and Connecticut gave up on its claims in that part of what is now Ohio. So there was a huge mass exodus of people from Connecticut west, not only to Ohio, but to western New York State, also to Vermont. So yeah, because when I heard the name Henry Calhoun, I mean, there was Henry Calhouns that I'm doing some research on, but this is obviously a much earlier Henry Calhoun, and was part of this exodus, to Ohio.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I know in our collection here at the Gunn Museum, we have a number of letters that were written by family members who left Washington to go to Ohio, and they were writing back to their family members in Washington. These include the Nettletons and the Hollisters and the Calhouns. So it's quite an interesting topic that I've always wanted to explore more, and maybe we could do an exhibit about that in the future and see where these Washington residents ended up settling in Ohio.
There was one census record that I found for one town in Ohio, and when I was doing some research on one of the families that had left, and I was just going, it was amazing going through the census to see all these family names that were all Connecticut or Washington, Connecticut family names. It was amazing.
It is very interesting, and I guess there were Calhoun references in both of the papers today, right? The author of the second paper was Henry Calhoun, and we heard of Simeon Calhoun, who was injured when the sledgehammer hit him on the head when they were constructing the Academy building on Washington Green in the 1870s.
I think Simeon was a Civil War veteran, wasn't he?
Right, yeah. Simeon was a veteran of the Civil War, and he actually ended up later in his life moving out to Oregon on the West Coast, and that's where he died and is buried. So it's really amazing how far people were able to travel back then. We think of them as, being limited. There not being automobiles back then, but they were moving around quite a bit. And I just wanted to mention, are there any other questions out there or comments? If anyone has a question or comment, feel free to unmute yourselves or raise your hand. You're all feel free to do that yourselves. I might not be able to see all of you at once. If not, there is something I wanted to mention about the Academy building. So as you heard in the first paper, that is where the town's library had its origins. On the second floor of that Academy building was where the library books were stored. You may have seen the floor plans that I showed in the presentation for the second floor, and in each corner up there is where they stored the library books. They locked them in the cabinet, and they had auctions of those books. And so this library association eventually becomes the Gunn Memorial Library and Museum that we know today. Of course, the Gunn Memorial Library building was designed by the architect Eric Rossiter, and it was constructed and opened in 1908. So prior to that time, that Academy building was the town's public library, and it operated a little bit differently than it does today with the auction of books. And we actually still have some of those original books in the Connecticut room at the Gunn Memorial Library. So if you're ever interested in taking a look at some of those books, get the key at the circulation desk, and you could go up there in the stacks and take a look at some of those original books. I think they're on the left when you enter the Connecticut room. And you'll see on the inside, there were labels that even said that people who won the auctions of the books were levied a fine if they dripped their candle wax onto the book while they were reading at night. So times have certainly changed. Anyone else with comments or questions out there about what you may have heard today in the presentation? Feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand or send some kind of signal. I also had another question or point. I guess, David, we heard about Earl Buckingham, and I believe he was the brother of Elnathan Buckingham, who became Mitchell. Am I correct there?
Yes. Yep.
You want to share that story? Because that's an interesting story in Washington's history about how Elnathan Buckingham became Elnathan Mitchell. And this is the brother of Earl Buckingham, who ran a singing school on Washington Green in the 19th century.
Might be, might be in, actually that might be his father. But yeah, there was Elnathan um, Buckingham, who became a Mitchell. He had a Mitchell um, uncle, Abner Mitchell, who was killed in the Civil War. And with the death of Abner Mitchell and the death of Abner Mitchell's children at a young age, there weren't going to be any more Mitchells in Washington, Connecticut. So his mother, who was born Mary Helen Mitchell and married to Buckingham, Earl Buckingham, um, asked if he'd be willing to change his family name to Mitchell. And he did. And he became, I guess, Elnathan Buckingham Mitchell. And, continued the Mitchell name for at least a couple more generations in Washington, though a lot of his children moved out of the area. So the name was continued for at least a few generations, and they're all buried in the Washington Green. And there was this habit of naming the first child either Abner or Elnathan that continued up until probably the 1920s, because my mother knew an Elnathan Mitchell, who would have been, I guess, a grandson of the Elnathan Buckingham, who had his name changed to Elnathan Mitchell. And of course, they were very successful eventually in the dairy business, and were quite successful in Bridgeport and had dairies all over the state at one point. So there's descendants of this fellow who changed his name. One of the descendants told me, "Yeah, I should really. My mother should have been a Buckingham rather than a Mitchell." He was quite amazed at that. But it was, it wasn't that unusual for people to take the names of just earlier deceased children in families. So I guess it sort of made sense to continue the family name in Washington of Mitchell for Elnathan Buckingham to be willing to change his name, family name to Mitchell.
Thanks, David. I forgot about the chat box. You could also type questions in there. So I see we have a question from Luke Hook. Where was Sabaday House located? Sabaday houses, from what I've read about them, were located all around the Congregational Church on Washington Green. I've not really seen definitive evidence as to their specific locations. I know that I have read a deed that I think came from the Logan family. Kenyon Clark let us make a copy of it over from their house on Romford Road, and they were selling, I guess, their Sabaday house, or their share in the Sabaday house, and so I guess it's my understanding that these houses were for the parishioners to basically warm up in and take their afternoon meal during intermission that we heard about during these very long church services, which went all day on Sunday in the very cold churches during the winter. And they would go and eat and warm up a bit in these Sabaday houses. And I thought I read something that one of them may have been located in the vicinity of where the Gunn Memorial Library building is today. And then the only
I thought they were all on Sabaday Lane.
Well, I don't know. I know that Madeline Revere's house, the first house on the left on Sabaday Lane, is supposed to be a Sabaday house. I'm not sure if that was moved there or if that's its original location. It's definitely a topic that I think needs further investigation. But yeah, David, do you think they were all on Sabaday Lane? I always thought they were scattered around the church, not too far from the church is what I've read.
Yeah, well, that makes sense that they would be close to the church, but for whatever reason, Sabaday Lane got the name Sabaday Lane, and I assume there had to be at least a few Sabaday houses on Sabaday Lane.
Yeah, I think so. And I'm wondering if what we call Wykeham Road today where it connects with Sabaday Lane was, originally all of that might have been Sabaday Lane at some point.
Of course, Wykeham Road was Litchfield Road at one time.
Right, right, exactly. And of course, the name Wykeham didn't come around until the Wykeham Rise Girls' School was constructed in the early 1900s here in Washington. Right, Luke continues to say, grew up on Blackville Road at the foot of Goose Hill, Sabaday Lane, and have wondered where the name came from. Yeah, so it's really interesting, when you do research into these place names, where did street names come from, and where did names for geographical features, hills and rock formations and things like that come from. Still trying to figure out where Hell Hollow was in Washington. We've seen several references to that, and it was mentioned again in the paper today. And there's a story of Frederick Gunn, the founder of the Gunnery, going to Hell Hollow to turn over some barrels of liquor, I guess, that some families were brewing in Hell Hollow. He was a big temperance guy, and I'm not sure where that was located or what families lived in Hell Hollow, but maybe we'll learn that someday. Does anyone else have any other questions or comments out there? Feel free to type them in the chat box or raise your hand. Feel free to unmute yourself. You should all be able to unmute yourself if you'd like to do that. My only other comment, I guess, was about the Reverend Gordon Hayes, who we heard about in the second paper. And some of you may have heard the story about Gordon Hayes before, but he was an interesting character. He preached a biblical justification of slavery here at the Congregational Church in Washington. I guess he was there in what, the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, around there.
Better close this.
And he caused, quite a controversy and encouraged his parishioners to remove their students from Frederick Gunn's school here in Washington. And so there were no students for Gunn to teach. And so he left town sort of in self-exile with his wife and went to Towanda, Pennsylvania, and opened a school there and taught for a number of years. And Reverend Hayes continued his ways and criticized Mary Brimsmaid Brown, who ran a girls' school in Washington Green, the Judea Female Seminary, because she brought her female students out on Washington Green, and they would do calisthenics and exercises and gymnastics and dance around. And Reverend Hayes did not like that, and he also criticized her. But the Brimsmaids were a really powerful and important family here in Washington, and that eventually led to Reverend Hayes's downfall, and he eventually moved on to he moved west, I think. I think it might have been Ohio or somewhere close by out there, where he spent his remaining years. So that's a little bit about Reverend Hayes. And I just loved in the first paper how we heard so much about the businesses on Washington Green that are no longer here, especially Erastus Hurlbert's store, his general store, and which had the theater above it. And, Washington was a very cultured place, even in the 19th century. And Frederick Gunn was involved in the production of these dramatic performances there. He felt that the town citizens not only needed a form of entertainment because they were far out in the country here, but also, some moral guidance as well with those plays that he was producing. Like we heard Uncle Tom's Cabin and other abolitionist plays that they watched. And then the other thing that I found really interesting, which we don't hear too much about, was, I guess, this whipping post or pillory on Washington Green. And it sounded like it was, they said it was in the northeast corner of the green, which sort of puts it, I think, right about at the intersection of Wykeham Road and Green Hill Road, sort of right across the street from the Gunn Museum today. I guess that's where they would enact their punishments and whip people and put them in the stocks. So that's another topic that I haven't read much about and haven't seen much about, but I'm sure there's great things to learn out there about crime and punishment in Washington's history. So another topic for us to look into as we go forward. With that, I see we're approaching our 1 hour mark here. So this is where we usually bring things to a conclusion. Is there anyone else out there that has a question for me or anyone else in attendance? Feel free to type it in the chat box or raise your hand, or feel free to unmute yourself. And I don't see anyone else. So I'm going to just remind you what you see on your screen here, that our upcoming museum programs on Zoom, we're going to continue with virtual programmings. Monday,
There's a
January.
list of people who are thanking, and Lisa Bolt is one of them.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Monday, January 11th at 6:30, we're going to have a special guest lecturer, Craig Furman. He's from Indiana. He's going to join us, and he's going to talk about presidents, their books, and their readers. And he's nationally known, and we're so fortunate to have him join us for this great presentation. And it's very timely with the inauguration happening the week after. And then on Monday, January 25th at 6:30, we'll be doing another readings from the archives. And this time the paper is going to be The Three Levitt Houses in the Levitt Store by Mary Mitchell Turner. It was written in 1921. And she talks about the Levitt family and everything that they were involved with on Washington Green. So please go to the Gunn Museum's website, gunnmuseum.org, and register for these programs and others that we have coming up through February and March as well on our website. And with that, I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. Please continue to stay safe and stay well. And on behalf of everyone here at the Gunn Museum, I would like to wish all of you a very happy and healthy holiday season and a prosperous new year. And we'll see you in 2021. Good night, everyone.